All right, welcome to a bit of a rush to conclude our timeline as we come to the end of the Old Testament in these four periods. So let's begin. We'll start with divided kingdom, then to the kingdom in exile, then we'll move into the time period of the return and the revolt. So on your timeline, you'll want to fill in the Bible passages when they come up. And then in your notes, just the headings for each of these will be according to the periods. Now, the first thing we're going to do is talk about history on the next slide. And you'll want to write down only what I tell you to write down in your notes. Please be aware you are not allowed to take screenshots and substitute screenshots for notes. Let's begin. Oh, also, there's going to be random quiz questions in here, so please make sure you are actually listening. Let's do this. Let's talk about history. Give or take, this is the kingdom of David, united and divided. It's somewhere around 1000 BC. You don't have to write the texts that are popping up underneath it, but you'll need to write down the date and the title of these kind of empires that are rising and falling. So just to give you context, King David ruled with Jerusalem as his capital, right? That's our last time period. Eventually, after the death of David's son Solomon in 931 BC, the kingdom was divided into a southern part, Judah, and Israel in the north. So that's the period we're going to talk about first. But let's look at what happens in history. A few hundred years after that, the Assyrians from Assyria rise to power. The Assyrians are from what today is called northern Iraq. They invaded the northern kingdom of Israel, and they deported the Jews to other parts of the empire. This deportation of the people of the north by Assyria is the end of the story of those 10 tribes. A few hundred years later, the Babylonians from Babylon rise to power. And they conquer the Assyrian Empire, and under King Nebuchadnezzar, they conquered Jerusalem. Eventually, after conquering Jerusalem, the Jews from the southern kingdom of Judea were deported into Babylon. And they also would destroy the temple, kind of the heart of Jewish identity. Shortly thereafter, the Persians would quickly rise to power. Persians are from Persia. And they, along with King Cyrus of Persia, today Iran, conquers the entire Babylonian Empire. And unlike the Babylonians and the Assyrians, they were pretty sympathetic to the Jews. So the Jews who were exiled in Babylon were allowed to return home. And when they went home, they would actually be funded on their voyage home by the Assyrian king Cyrus. And they rebuilt a much more modest, small temple, nothing compared to what they once had. But it's this new temple that would still exist around the time of Jesus. Okay. A few hundred years later, the Greeks under Alexander the Great would rise to power. Alexander would destroy the Persian Empire and gain control over Judea. This is where the southern tribes of the Jews. And then after his death, the empire that he conquered would be split between 3 different rulers, and Jews got squeezed into the different competing rulers who are all now kind of backbiting and fighting each other. A few hundred years later, you now have the story of the Maccabees. This story is captured in the Catholic Bible, but not in the Protestant Bible. The story of the Maccabees is really awesome, and we'll talk about that. But the Maccabees is a Jewish from the Jewish tribe, is a particular tribe from the southern tribes. They revolted against the Hellenistic occupiers. Hellenism is essentially the merger of the Greek and Roman empires. The Greek Empire, not the Romans yet. They would revolt against the Greeks, and they had a short victory where they would become an independent Jewish state. But that did not last for more than 80 years, because after the Greeks, the next world power were the Romans. The Romans would piggyback off of the Greeks and essentially reconquer the known world. And the Romans kind of merged parts of the empire together, and they did initially grant Jews some religious freedom and autonomy, but eventually Judea would fall under the rule of Rome. And we know that for a fact because think of the story of Jesus. At his death, he was sent to Pontius Pilate, a Roman authority figure who governed the area. And in that same story, Jesus would be then shuffled over to King Herod, who's not really a king, not a proper king of Israel, of Judea, of the Jews. He was a puppet king set up to kind of appease the people, which is exactly why the people hated him. And then we have the story of Herod the Great. Herod was the puppet king put into power, and when he died, roughly around the time of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, his sons would inherit different parts of his throne, and one of them is known as the particular person that Jesus would encounter at his death. He was nothing like his father. He was a lot more less of an administrator and more of a lazy, incompetent, self-grandizing dictator, something like that. Then we have, now this is about 40 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, who would stand in front of this new temple built during the return home from exile during that period of the Persians. Jesus would stand for that temple and kind of proclaim that like this temple is going to be destroyed in 3 days. I'm going to raise it up again. They had no idea what he was talking about because they're like, do you know how long it took to build this temple? Jesus was talking about his body. But then there were other predictions about that very temple being destroyed if there wasn't a repentance and conversion. And sure enough, 40 years after Jesus, the Romans were tired of revolts in this Jewish area. And so they just kind of came in with legions of soldiers and destroyed the city. Every stone, the goal was to destroy, to like knock down every stone, destroy the temple. It was so devastating to the psyche of the Jews that to this day they have never rebuilt a temple. The Jews who did not believe Jesus the Messiah is still waiting for a Messiah to come and rebuild the temple. So under the Emperor Titus, squashed another rebellion, and then they came in and reduced the temple to rubble. Some of the Jews continued to fight, but ultimately they were all defeated by Rome. All right, so that's a bit history. You don't have to write all the details, but you should have an idea of the order of these events and some general sense of what's happening in history. So let's begin with the divided kingdom. The color for the divided kingdom is black. The main book of the divided kingdom is 1 Kings, the second half of 1 Kings. Okay. The black color signifies the dark days that are looming and the division that's about to happen, and the judgment if the north and the south don't listen to the prophets, if they don't repent. So we talk about the divided kingdom. God calls Isaiah and the story of Hosea, the prophet who has to marry a prostitute. So let's take a quick look here. The kingdom divides and is destroyed. The northern tribes form what we call the kingdom of Israel. So those are 10 tribes in the north. They call themselves now the kingdom of Israel. Their leader is Jeroboam, who revolts against the Davidic throne. And in doing so, he separates himself from the throne and the temple, which is in the south in Jerusalem. So let's look at that causes a problem, and I want to give you a sense of that. There are 10 tribes in the north. They make their capital city Samaria. That's right. If you know anything about New Testament Bible stories, like the story of the Good Samaritan, why that story was shocking to Jews is that Jesus used a Samaritan to teach the Jews about what it means to love your neighbor. The Jews hated the Samaritans because the Samaritans were once Jews. They were former brothers and sisters way back in history who were conquered by enemies and kind of became watered down Israelites. They ended up intermarrying into other cultures, and so the Jews know who these people are, the Samaritans, but hated them because they reflected to the Jews kind of their own sins and their own failures as a people. Okay, but here's the thing: they had 19 kings before they were destroyed. They separated, had 19 different kings, and then were overcome by their enemies and destroyed. But they had 9 different dynasties. What does that tell you? A nation with 19 kings, but 9 dynasties tells you that there was no stability. A dynasty is a line, a family that produces successors. So what you have is in 19 kings, different families entered in, had like military coups, assassinations, whatever, and new kings would be placed. It was political instability. And that's a sign that there's something fundamentally wrong with the divided kingdom, but specifically with the northern kingdom. And here's a lesson. We kind of always say this, everything happens for a reason. But that's kind of like, I once saw a t-shirt that said, everything happens for a reason, and sometimes it's because you're stupid and make bad decisions. Okay, that's a little harsh, but here's the truth. Everything does happen for a reason because God is in charge. But that doesn't mean everything works out for us. Because God is in charge, he allows everything to happen. And sometimes the reason things happen in our lives is because we're making bad choices and turning away from God, not obeying him, and we're kind of trying to write our own story. So Israel here, everything happens for a reason, but their fate, it will be sealed when they refuse to turn back to God. God is waiting the second you turn back to create a reason out of the chaos. He's ready to put meaning into the mess that we make of our lives. But if we don't turn back, it's just a mess. If we don't turn back, our problems don't have purposes. They just are problems. And that's what Israel failed to listen to and understand. God sent them prophets like Elijah and Elisha to warn them about idolatry, that the mess that they're in, all the political instability, all the different kings and assassinations, all of it at its source is idolatry. It's similar to what happened during the period of the Judges, where you get that cycle of sin, and Israel kept forgetting God and then turning to their own passions and sins and then falling into idolatry, and then the enemies would show up. But here they didn't turn back to God. Instead, because they cut themselves off from Jerusalem, like they were angry at the Davidic throne because the Davidic throne had failed. It did exactly what the prophet said kings would do: crushing taxes, forced military service, etc. But in rejecting the bad things, they also rejected the good things. They cut themselves off from the temple, from the worship of God. And next thing you know, they fell into idolatry. So the consequence for not turning back, in 722 BC, the Assyrians would conquer Israel and scatter the 10 tribes of people forever. They would separate families. They would force people into marrying other cultures and other people. They would separate husbands and wives and children and force them into other parts of the world and force them to get married to other people. Why? So that there would never be descendants. There would never be children from families who would remember the old days and want to rebel and fight back. By forcing a husband and wife to separate and sending their kids somewhere else, everyone kind of gives up, surrenders. There's no way of knowing where people are in the world. And so they would eventually move on with their lives, marry into other cultures, and lose their ethnic identity. And they would never become an enemy again because they now have made a new life if they were lucky. So let's look at the south now. The southern tribes form the kingdom of Judea. That's the name there, the kingdom of Judea. These are the tribes in the south. There are 2 of them. The leader, Rehoboam, remains faithful. It's a son of Solomon, remains faithful to the throne. And despite some failures and shortcomings in the south, they remain faithful to the covenant God establishes through David. Let's look at the overview. Look how starkly different it is. There are 2 tribes in the south. Their capital city is Jerusalem, which is where the temple is. They also have 19 kings and 1 queen, but all of it comes out of one royal dynasty. It is connected to the promise God made to Abraham about leaving your kin, your country, and your father's homeland, right? God promised that there's going to be a royal dynasty, a universal blessing. Though both kingdoms failed, the southern kingdom continued to hold on to that promise and look at the political stability. In the north, it took like 300 years before all the people were destroyed and devastated. In the south, because they continued to listen to prophets in ways that the northern tribes didn't, they continued on longer. But even there was like a lack of faithfulness. So problems and lessons. Um, we do not, we cannot do God's will or receive His blessings if we don't forgive others. And that's a fundamental truth. That no matter how much you hold on to the covenant blessings, if you don't obey God, if you don't do what He says, you cannot inherit blessing. You don't get blessing simply by being a chosen people. You're a chosen people because you choose to obey God and you receive His inheritance. So the prophets like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah are in the south, and they warn the south about honoring the Jubilee, which is a celebration. It's like um, uh, every I don't know, it's like 49 years, 50 years. It's a huge celebration, the Jubilee, where any slaves that you have because of indentured servitude, that's a real thing where they're not slaves who have no rights. They're slaves who enter into slavery in order to pay off their own debts. When the Jubilee year comes, all debts have to be forgiven, and all slaves are freed and given their own property. It is radically unheard of in ancient history that God was like trying to teach Israel that there would be a time someday in the future where the Jubilee year wouldn't just be a thing that happens once every generation. It would be something that could happen at any moment. That our debts, our sin, that's a spiritual reading, would be forgiven, no matter how great they were, and that no matter what kind of slavery we're in to sin, that God would come and set us free. This is very much a prophecy of Jesus and what God wanted to do, despite how hard it was economically, but forgiving debt, releasing captives, releasing slaves. God demanded that Israel honor that. And Israel kind of did, but eventually they refused because by setting slaves free, forgiving debt, you lose wealth, but you gain something from God. And eventually Israel forgot to be faithful to that. So the consequence was much later than their northern friends. In 587 BC, Babylon rises to power, comes in, destroys the heart of Israel identity, the temple, which is ironic, right? The temple is their identity, but to God, temple worship didn't matter anymore because they refused to be faithful to what God said. So it doesn't matter what you sacrifice on an altar if you first don't obey God in your heart. And then later in 605 BC, Babylon, like Assyria, captures the people, exiles the people out of there in 3 waves of deportation. And we will continue the next section shortly after this little break. See you in the next video.